Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when two worlds collide unexpectedly. When duty meets desperation, when honor faces hardship, and when a single act of kindness can change everything. This is the story of how a chance encounter outside Buckingham Palace became a turning point that neither man saw coming. It's about what happens when someone who has sworn to protect a nation meets someone who has already sacrificed everything for it. In a world where we often walk past each other without truly seeing, this is a reminder that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes they find each other when they need it most. What you're about to read isn't just about a royal guard and a veteran. It's about the invisible bonds that connect us all, the weight of service that some carry alone, and the extraordinary power of human connection to heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. This is a story that will stay with you long after you finish reading, because it shows us that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but right here, in the quiet moments when one person chooses to see another's pain and do something about it. The morning mist hung low over London as Sergeant James Richardson adjusted his red tunic for the third time that hour. 26 years old with steel blue eyes that missed nothing, James had been guarding Buckingham Palace for 4 years. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor-sharp, and his black bearskin hat sat perfectly positioned. To the thousands of tourists who would pass by that day, he was simply part of the pageantry, a living statue representing centuries of British tradition. But James was more than a symbol. Born in a small Yorkshire town where his father had worked the coal mines until they closed, he understood what it meant to struggle. His decision to join the Queen's Guard hadn't been about prestige or ceremony. It had been about purpose, about serving something greater than himself. For years of standing motionless for hours, of maintaining perfect composure while tourists tried to make him laugh or flinch, had taught him patience and observation skills that went far beyond military training. As he took his position at the palace gates, James noticed something unusual. Among the usual crowd of picture-taking tourists and school groups, there was a man who wasn't behaving like the others. He wasn't snapping photos or chattering excitedly. Instead, he stood about 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, just watching. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, wearing clothes that had seen better days. His dark green jacket was clean but worn thin at the elbows, and his jeans had been mended multiple times. What caught James's attention wasn't the man's appearance, though. It was the way he carried himself. Despite his shabby clothes, there was something unmistakably military about his posture. The way his shoulders sat square, the way his eyes constantly scanned the area, the unconscious habit of standing with his feet slightly apart in a stable stance. Thomas Mitchell had been standing behind that tree for 3 hours. This was his 4th day coming to this spot, though he couldn't really explain why. Something about watching the guards, seeing the discipline and purpose in their movements, brought him a strange sense of peace. It reminded him of a time when his own life had structure and meaning. 6 months ago, Thomas had been a respected sergeant in the British Army. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, leading a small unit responsible for training local police forces. He'd been good at his job, respected by his men, and proud of the difference he was making. Then came the roadside bomb that changed everything. The explosion itself wasn't what broke him. Thomas had walked away from it with only minor injuries while 2 of his men hadn't been so lucky. The guilt of surviving when others didn't, combined with images that played on repeat in his mind every time he closed his eyes, had gradually eaten away at everything he thought he knew about himself. The Army had tried to help. They provided counseling, medication, and eventually an honorable discharge with full benefits. But Thomas had felt like a fraud accepting help for wounds that didn't show. Physical injuries were easy to understand and treat. The invisible ones were harder to explain, especially to himself. His wife Sarah had tried to be supportive, but watching the man she'd married slowly disappear behind sleepless nights and emotional walls had eventually become too much. She'd moved out 3 months ago, taking their 8-year-old daughter Emma with her. Thomas understood. He'd probably have done the same thing if their positions were reversed. The small flat he'd found wasn't much, but it was all he could afford. His military pension covered the basics, but pride had prevented him from seeking additional help. He'd spent his adult life solving other people's problems. Admitting he couldn't solve his own felt like the final defeat. So he wandered London's streets during the day, avoiding the flat that felt more like a prison than a home. Something about the city's rhythm, the constant motion of people who had places to go and things to do, made him feel less isolated. And, somehow, he'd found himself drawn to this spot outside Buckingham Palace. James had been trained to notice details, and the details about this particular observer were starting to concern him. The man came every day around the same time, and stayed for hours. He never caused any trouble, never approached the gates or acted suspiciously. But there was something in his eyes that James recognized from his own reflection on bad days. It was pain. During his brief breaks, James had managed to observe more. The man's clothes were clean but limited, suggesting he might be wearing everything he owned. His shoes were military issue, old but well-maintained. Most telling was the way he sometimes reached unconsciously toward his left shoulder, as if expecting to find something there. James had seen enough veterans to recognize the gesture of someone missing the weight of rank insignia. On this particular Tuesday morning, something was different. The man looked worse than usual. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped the tree bark for support. James watched as the man swayed on his feet, clearly struggling with something beyond physical exhaustion. Thomas hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that Humvee, watching the explosion tear through the vehicle behind them in slow motion. The guilt was getting worse, not better. His medication wasn't helping anymore, and he'd started skipping doses anyway because they made him feel disconnected from reality. Standing behind the tree, watching the guards go through their practiced routines, Thomas felt the familiar wave of despair washing over him. These men had purpose. They belonged somewhere. They mattered. He was just taking up space in a world that would probably function better without him. The thought that had been growing stronger each day whispered in his mind again. Maybe it would be easier for everyone if he just disappeared. Sarah and Emma could move on with their lives without worrying about him. The army wouldn't have to keep paying benefits to someone who couldn't even function as a civilian. James noticed the change immediately. The man's posture had shifted from tired to defeated. His head hung lower, and he'd stopped his usual scanning of the area. Something in the man's body language triggered every protective instinct James had developed during his years of service. Military protocol was clear. James was not supposed to leave his post except in emergencies or during scheduled breaks. He was not supposed to interact with civilians beyond basic directions when directly approached. His job was to stand guard, maintain the dignity of the position, and represent the crown with unwavering discipline. But James had also sworn an oath to serve and protect. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him that the man behind the tree needed help. The changing of the guard wasn't for another 2 hours. James's relief wouldn't come until then. But something about the way the man was standing, the defeat in his shoulders, made James feel that waiting 2 hours might be too long. James made a decision that would have surprised his superiors. Moving with the practiced precision that had made him one of the most respected guards in his unit, he stepped away from his post and began walking toward the tree. The tourists nearby stopped taking pictures, confused by the sight of a Queen's Guard breaking protocol. Some reached for their phones, sensing they might be witnessing something unusual. But James's focus was entirely on the man who hadn't yet noticed his approach. Thomas was lost in dark thoughts when he heard the distinctive sound of military boots on pavement. He looked up, expecting to see a policeman coming to move him along. Instead, he found himself face to face with one of the Queen's Guards. Up close, the guard looked younger than Thomas had expected, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of experience beyond his years. The red tunic was immaculate, every detail perfect, but it was the guard's expression that caught Thomas off guard. There was no authority or suspicion there. Instead, there was something that looked almost like concern. "Are you all right, mate?" James asked quietly, his Yorkshire accent softening the formality of his appearance. Thomas was so surprised by the question that he couldn't immediately respond. When was the last time someone had asked if he was all right, and seemed to genuinely want an answer? "I'm fine," Thomas replied automatically, the response that had become his default to everyone who asked. James studied his face for a moment. "No," he said gently. "I don't think you are." Something about the guard's directness, combined with the kindness in his voice, cracked something in Thomas's carefully constructed walls. For a moment, he felt tears threatening, and he looked away quickly. "I'm not supposed to be talking to you," Thomas said, trying to deflect. "Won't you get in trouble for leaving your post?" James glanced back toward the palace, where his absence had definitely been noticed. "Probably," he admitted. "But some things are more important than protocol." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at this young guard who was risking professional consequences for a stranger, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Someone cared enough to break rules for him. "What's your name?" James asked. "Thomas. Thomas Mitchell." "I'm James. James Richardson." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "You served, didn't you?" Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. "Afghanistan." Another nod. James understood now. The pieces fell into place, the recognition of shared experience crossing the gap between them. "How long have you been out?" 6 months, Thomas managed. "And how are you really doing, Thomas?" It was such a simple question, but asked with such genuine concern that Thomas felt his defenses crumbling. How long had it been since someone had looked at him and really seen him, rather than just seeing his problems? "Not good," Thomas whispered, the admission costing him everything he had left. James nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "When did you last eat?" Thomas tried to remember. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before." "Right." James made another decision that would have shocked his superiors. "My break is in about 15 minutes. There's a cafe around the corner. Will you wait for me?" Thomas looked at him with confusion. "Why?" "Because you look like someone who could use a friend," James said simply. "And because I think there's more to your story than standing behind a tree every day." The directness of the statement should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to him in months. "You don't even know me," Thomas protested weakly. "No," James agreed. "But I know what it looks like when someone's fighting a battle they can't win alone. And I know what it feels like to wear a uniform that means something." Thomas felt something shift inside him. For months, he'd been invisible to the world, just another person taking up space on London streets. But this guard, this young man who could have stayed at his post and minded his own business, had seen him. Really seen him. "Will you wait?" James asked again. Thomas looked into the guard's eyes and saw something he hadn't seen directed at him in a very long time. Respect. Not pity, not judgment, just simple human respect for whatever he was going through. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "I'll wait." James nodded and began walking back toward his post. As he moved away, Thomas called after him. "James." The guard turned back. "Thank you." James smiled, the expression transforming his formal features into something warmly human. "Don't thank me yet. Just wait for me, all right?" As James resumed his position at the palace gates, Thomas remained by the tree, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in months, he wasn't alone with his thoughts. Someone had seen him, acknowledged his pain, and offered help without asking for anything in return. The tourists continued taking pictures, unaware that they had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. A young guard had chosen compassion over protocol, and a struggling veteran had accepted an offer of friendship from a complete stranger. Neither man knew it yet, but this moment would become the foundation of a bond that would change both their lives. Sometimes the most important connections happen when we least expect them, between people who seem to have nothing in common except their humanity. As Thomas waited by the tree, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was small and fragile, but it was there. And for the first time since leaving the army, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, there might be a way forward after all. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Thomas shifted his weight from foot to foot, second-guessing his decision to stay. What was he doing? Waiting for a stranger who had probably already forgotten about him. But something deeper than logic kept him rooted to the spot. The genuine concern in the guard's eyes had been the first real human connection he'd felt in months. When James finally appeared around the corner, he traded his ceremonial uniform for civilian clothes. Jeans, a simple blue sweater, and trainers made him look completely different from the formal figure who'd approached Thomas earlier. Without the uniform's authority, he seemed younger, more approachable, but no less sincere. "Still here?" James observed with a small smile as he approached. Still here, Thomas confirmed, though his voice carried a note of surprise at his own decision. The cafe James led them to was a small, family-run place tucked between a bookshop and a dry cleaner. The kind of establishment that had probably been serving the neighborhood for decades. Mismatched chairs, worn wooden tables, and the smell of real coffee brewing created an atmosphere that was welcoming without trying too hard. 2 full breakfasts and coffee, James told the elderly woman behind the counter without consulting Thomas. When Thomas started to protest about the expense, James waved him off. My treat. When did you last have a proper meal? Thomas couldn't remember, which was probably answer enough. They found a table in the back corner, away from the few other customers. The cafe's warmth was a sharp contrast to the autumn chill outside, and Thomas realized how cold he'd been standing behind that tree for hours every day. So, James said as their coffee arrived, how does a soldier end up watching palace guards from behind a tree? The question was direct, but not demanding. Thomas found himself appreciating James's straightforward approach. No dancing around the subject, no carefully worded therapeutic questions. Just honest curiosity from someone who seemed to genuinely want to understand. I don't really know, Thomas admitted. I started walking around London after I got out. Just to have somewhere to go, you know? And I ended up at the palace one day. Something about watching you all, the routine, the purpose of it, felt familiar. James nodded. Like watching something you used to be part of. Exactly. Thomas was surprised by how well this young man understood. In Afghanistan, everything had a purpose. Every day had structure. Even when things went wrong, we all knew our roles, knew what we were supposed to do. And now, Thomas stared into his coffee cup. Now I wake up and have nowhere to be, nothing that needs doing, no one counting on me. I'm just taking up space. The breakfast arrived before James could respond. Full English plates loaded with eggs, bacon, sausages, beans, and toast. Thomas's stomach cramped with hunger at the sight, reminding him just how little he'd been eating. Dig in, James encouraged, noting Thomas's hesitation. Food's getting cold. As they ate, Thomas found himself relaxing for the first time in months. James didn't push for more information, didn't try to offer solutions or advice. He simply shared the space and the meal, occasionally making observations about the other customers or asking Thomas's opinion about football. It was only when Thomas had cleared most of his plate that James returned to more serious topics. You mentioned you served in Afghanistan. What was your role there? Training local police forces, Thomas replied. Working with village leaders to establish security protocols, teaching basic law enforcement techniques. It was good work. Felt like we were actually making a difference, you know? That's impressive work, James said, and Thomas could tell he meant it. Complex stuff, building trust with local communities. It was. Thomas's expression darkened, right up until everything went wrong. James waited, letting the silence stretch without pressure. It was a technique he'd learned during his own difficult moments, the power of simply being present while someone decided whether to share their pain. Thomas found himself wanting to talk about what happened. For months, the memory had felt too heavy, too dangerous to share. But something about James's calm presence made it feel possible. We were returning from a village about 30 kilometers outside Kabul. Thomas began slowly. Regular training mission, nothing unusual. My unit was in the lead vehicle, convoy of 3 trucks behind us. He paused, his hands unconsciously gripping his coffee mug tighter. The bomb was buried in the road. Perfectly placed, professionally done. We drove right over it. But somehow our truck wasn't positioned quite right when it went off. The explosion took out the second vehicle completely. James's expression remained steady, encouraging without being pushy. 4 good men died instantly. 2 others were injured so badly they'll never be the same. And I walked away with a few cuts and a ringing in my ears that cleared up after a week. That's not your fault, James said quietly. Isn't it? Thomas's voice carried months of accumulated guilt. I was the senior NCO. I chose the route, set the pace, made the decisions that put us in that exact spot at that exact time. If I'd chosen different timing, a different route, if I'd been more careful about intelligence reports, you'd what? Predict where every bomb was buried? Read the minds of people who wanted to kill you. James's tone was gentle but firm. Thomas, you made the best decisions you could with the information you had. That's all any of us can do. Thomas looked at him skeptically. You sound like the counselors. Maybe because they're right about some things, James replied. How old are you? 42. So you served, what, 20 years before Afghanistan? Close to it. And, in all that time, how many good decisions did you make? How many people did you train, protect, or help? How many missions went right because of your leadership? Thomas hadn't thought about it that way. The bad day had overshadowed everything that came before it. I imagine it was hundreds, James continued. Maybe thousands of good decisions, successful missions, people who went home safe because of something you did. But you're defining yourself by one moment when things went wrong despite your best efforts. The words hit harder than Thomas expected, not because they were harsh, but because they carried the ring of truth he'd been avoiding. It doesn't feel that simple, Thomas said. Because it's not simple, James agreed. Guilt isn't logical. Neither is grief. They don't care about your track record or your intentions. They just hurt. Thomas looked across the table at this young man who seemed to understand things that Thomas's own family couldn't grasp. How do you know so much about this? You look like you're about 12 years old. James laughed, the sound genuine and warm. 26, actually. And I know because my dad went through something similar. Military. Minor. Worked the pits in Yorkshire for 30 years until they started closing. He was a safety supervisor, responsible for keeping the crews safe underground. There was an accident during his last year. Cave-in that trapped 6 men. Dad was off shift that day, but he'd signed off on the safety protocols for that section. James's expression grew more serious as he continued. All 6 men made it out alive, but 2 were badly injured. Dad blamed himself for months, convinced that if he'd done something differently, spotted some danger sign, those men wouldn't have been hurt. What happened? Nearly drank himself to death, James said bluntly. Mom left him for a while, took my sister and me to stay with my grandmother. I was 14, angry at him for falling apart when we needed him strong. Thomas felt a chill of recognition. How did he get through it? Tom mostly. And help from people who understood what he was carrying. Other miners who'd been through similar situations. Eventually, he realized that beating himself up wasn't helping the men who'd been injured, wasn't bringing back the mines that were closing, wasn't solving anything. And your mom? Came back when he started getting help. Took time to rebuild trust, but they're still together 35 years later. James studied Thomas's face. But the real turning point was when Dad started using his experience to help other miners who were struggling with the closures. Turned his pain into something useful. Thomas absorbed this information. Is that why you became a guard? Family tradition of service? Partly, James admitted. But mostly because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. After watching Dad fall apart and rebuild himself, I understood how important it is to have purpose, structure, something that matters. And it works for you? Most days, James said honestly. Though standing motionless for hours while tourists try to make you laugh isn't exactly combat patrol. Thomas almost smiled at that. Different kind of discipline required. Exactly. Mental discipline more than physical. Learning to be present without being reactive, to observe without engaging unless absolutely necessary. They sat quietly for a moment, both lost in thought. The cafe was starting to fill up with the lunch crowd, but their corner table felt removed from the bustle. Can I ask you something? Thomas said eventually. Sure. Why did you approach me today? Really? You could have gotten in serious trouble for leaving your post. James considered the question carefully. Because I've been watching you for 4 days, and today you look like someone who'd made a decision I was worried about. The honesty of the response caught Thomas off guard. What kind of decision? The kind that can't be undone, James said quietly. And because I recognized something in the way you were standing. My dad had the same look right before he disappeared for 3 days, and we thought we'd lost him. Thomas felt his throat tighten. James had seen more than he'd realized. What made you think I wouldn't just tell you to leave me alone? I didn't think that. I hoped you wouldn't, but I didn't know. Sometimes you just have to take a chance on someone. And if I had told you to go away, then I would have gone away, James said simply. But I would have found a way to keep an eye on you. Maybe asked one of the local police to check in, or found someone else who could help. Thomas felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. James had been observing, planning, taking responsibility for a stranger's welfare without being asked. You barely know me, Thomas pointed out. True, James agreed. But I know what it looks like when someone's drowning. And I know what it feels like to watch someone you care about go under. The simple statement carried weight that Thomas couldn't ignore. Here was someone willing to extend himself for a stranger, based on nothing more than observation and instinct. I wasn't going to. Thomas began, then stopped. He wasn't sure he could honestly finish that sentence. Maybe not today, James said gently. But the thought's been there, hasn't it? Thomas nodded, unable to speak. I understand, James said. After everything you've been through, after losing the structure and purpose that defined you for 20 years, it makes sense that you'd wonder if there's any point in continuing. The validation was unexpected and powerful. No one else had acknowledged that his feelings made sense, that his despair was a logical response to his circumstances. But here's what I think, James continued. I think you're judging yourself by the wrong criteria. You're measuring your worth by what you've lost instead of what you still have to offer. What do I have to offer? Thomas asked, the question carrying genuine confusion. Experience, knowledge, understanding of what it means to serve, to lead, to make difficult decisions under pressure. Insight into what it's like to carry responsibility for other people's lives. James leaned forward, his expression intense, but not overwhelming. There are probably dozens of veterans in this city right now going through exactly what you're going through. Feeling lost, isolated, useless. And you're the one person who could understand exactly what they're facing, who could help them see a way forward. Thomas had never thought about his experience that way. I can barely help myself. Right now, maybe. But that doesn't mean it will always be that way. And helping someone else often helps us figure out our own situation. Like your dad helping other miners? Exactly like that. He couldn't fix the mine's closing, couldn't undo the accident that hurt his friends. But he could use what he'd learned to help other people facing similar challenges. Thomas felt something stirring in his chest. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. What would it look like to turn his pain into something useful? I wouldn't know where to start, he said. Start with getting yourself stable, James replied. Basic stuff. Regular meals, proper sleep, maybe talking to someone professional about what you've been carrying. I tried counseling. Didn't help much. Different counselors work for different people. And sometimes you need to be in a different place mentally before you can hear what they're saying. James glanced at his watch. I need to get back soon. But before I go, can I ask you to do something? What? Come back tomorrow. Same time, same place. Not to watch from behind a tree, but to meet me when I go on break. Thomas felt a familiar urge to decline, to retreat back into isolation. But something about James's steady presence made him want to try. Why? Because I think you could use a friend. And because I think I could too. The admission surprised Thomas. This confident young man who seemed to have his life perfectly ordered needed friendship too? You seem like you've got everything figured out, Thomas observed. James laughed. Standing in one position for hours wearing a heavy uniform and a fur hat? Believe me, I've got plenty of my own challenges. Different from yours, but challenges nonetheless. The humanness of the response made James seem more real, less like some perfect soldier and more like an actual person. Okay, Thomas said quietly. I'll come back tomorrow. Good, James smiled. And Thomas? Eat something between now and then. Proper food, not just whatever's cheapest. As they left the cafe together, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of despair. For the first time since leaving the army, he had plans that extended beyond just getting through the day. James walked with him partway back toward the palace before they parted ways. As Thomas watched the young guard disappear around a corner, he realized that something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer completely alone with his pain. Tomorrow felt possible in a way it hadn't for months. Not easy, not perfect, but possible. And for now, that was enough. Thomas woke up the next morning with something he hadn't felt in months. Anticipation. Not excitement exactly, but a reason to get out of bed that extended beyond basic survival. He had somewhere to be, someone expecting him. The feeling was foreign and welcome. His small flat looked different in the morning light. Still shabby, still depressing, but somehow less like a prison. He found himself actually looking in the mirror as he prepared to leave, noticing that he needed a shave and that his clothes could use a wash. For For the first time in months, these observations felt like problems he could solve rather than evidence of his complete failure as a human being. The walk to Buckingham Palace felt different too. Instead of aimless wandering with no destination, he had purpose. James had asked him to come back, had made time in his day for a stranger. The simple act of being expected somewhere was more powerful than Thomas had realized. He arrived early, positioning himself at a coffee stand across from the palace where he could watch the guards without hiding behind trees. The vendor, a cheerful Middle Eastern man who'd probably been serving that corner for years, greeted him with the kind of genuine warmth that London street vendors perfected. "First time watching the guards?" the man asked as he prepared Thomas's coffee. "Not exactly," Thomas replied. "I've been coming for a few days. They're impressive, aren't they? The discipline, the tradition. My son wants to join the military when he's older. Says he wants to be like them." Thomas found himself studying the guards with new appreciation. Yesterday, they'd represented everything he'd lost. Today, through James's eyes, he could see the skill and dedication their performance required. James appeared exactly on time, moving with the same purposeful stride that had caught Thomas's attention the day before. When he spotted Thomas at the coffee stand, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You came," James said, approaching with a smile. "You doubted me?" "Not doubted. Hoped. There's a difference." They walked to a different cafe this time, a slightly more upscale place with proper table service and a menu that went beyond basic breakfast fare. James seemed more relaxed today, less concerned about Thomas's immediate welfare and more interested in getting to know him as a person. "Tell me about your family," James said after they'd ordered. "You mentioned a wife and daughter yesterday." Thomas's expression clouded. "Sarah and Emma. Sarah's a nurse at Guy's Hospital. Emma's 8, smart as anything, loves football and reading in equal measure. And they're not with you now." "No." Thomas stared at his hands. "Sarah moved out 3 months ago. Took Emma to stay with her sister in Brighton. Can't say I blame her. Have you talked to them since?" "A few phone calls. Sarah's trying to be supportive, but I can hear the exhaustion in her voice. She spent months trying to help me, and I just kept getting worse." James nodded thoughtfully. "What was it like when you first got back, before things got difficult?" "The first few weeks were okay," Thomas reflected. "I was adjusting to civilian life, but Sarah was patient. Emma was excited to have me home all the time. I thought I was handling things well." "What changed?" Thomas considered the question. He'd never really analyzed the progression of his decline before. "Sleep, first. I started having trouble sleeping, but I told myself it was just adjusting to a different schedule. Then, the dreams started. Not nightmares exactly, just very vivid replays of things that had happened over there, including the bombing, among other things. But the bombing was the worst. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I should have done something different, should have seen some sign that would have saved those men." James listened without interrupting, letting Thomas set the pace of his story. Sarah tried to be understanding. "But how do you explain to someone who's never been in combat that you feel guilty for surviving? She kept saying I should be grateful to be alive, and she was right. But being right didn't make the guilt go away." "What about Emma? How did she handle your coming home?" Thomas's expression softened. "She was wonderful at first. Wanted to spend every minute with me, show me everything she'd learned while I was away. Her school had done projects about military families, so she understood more than most kids her age about deployment. But then, I started becoming someone she didn't recognize. Short-tempered, distant, jumping at loud noises. I stopped being able to play with her the way she remembered. Everything felt too intense, too overwhelming. The food arrived, but Thomas barely noticed. Talking about his family was both painful and necessary. "The breaking point came about 4 months ago," he continued. "Emma had a friend over for a playdate. They were playing in the garden, making noise the way kids do, laughing, running around, being completely normal 8-year-olds. James sensed this was leading somewhere important. A neighbor was doing construction next door, using some kind of power tool. The combination of the noise and the kids' excitement, it just triggered something in me. Suddenly, I was back in Afghanistan, hearing explosions, thinking about threats, ready to take cover. What happened? I shouted at the girls to get down, to find cover. Scared them both badly. Emma's friend started crying, and Emma looked at me like I was a stranger. Sarah had to call the friend's parents to come pick her up early. Thomas's voice grew quieter. That night, Emma asked Sarah if Daddy was broken, and I realized she was right to ask. James felt the weight of that moment. How did Sarah react? She tree.